Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we will be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, the campaign would love to connect with you on social media. So on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. The webinar will begin shortly and it will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez and I will be behind the scenes helping to produce this webinar. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure to select panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We will dedicate the last 20 to 30 minutes to respond to the questions you post during the discussion. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all who registered. We are also live streaming this webinar on our Facebook page. And lastly, we will be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This just helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Lastly, before we start, I would just like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Later today, we have The Way Forward, Guided by Lessons Learned the Hard Way, Teachers Respond. This webinar is part 2 of the conversation we will have during the next 90 minutes, where we will hear reactions and insights from leaders of teacher voice groups across the country. On January 19th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we have COVID-19 and learning loss, what the data tells us about what's happening. And on January 26th, we have 2 back-to-back webinars. At 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we have the Crucible of Practice with Kansas City. And at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we have COVID-19 and learning loss, what the data tell us about moving forward as well. We will be sure to add a link in the chat box for more information and registration for these upcoming learning opportunities. And joining you now is Yoli Flores, Chief Learning Officer for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar, the first of 2021. I want to acknowledge that we've all been distracted by the difficult and surreal past few days, not to mention a very difficult 2020. So I'm grateful to have an opportunity to have us all for a moment turn our attention to our work and the things we care about and hold sacred, which is the education and well-being of our children. As we thought about how we might begin our learning conversations this year, we thought it would be most appropriate to start off with the voices of teachers, providing us the opportunity to recognize and appreciate the heroic efforts of teachers across the country in what has been a most difficult and challenging year, one like no other. In every city and town across the state, across every state, we all witnessed or personally experienced the disruptions of school closures. 56 million children and youth would suddenly have their learning interrupted, and too many would lose the essential daily routine of learning and engaging with their teachers, interacting with their peers, having a place where they could count on 2 meals and so much more. And their teachers would suddenly be confronted with the challenge of figuring out how to keep the magic of teaching and learning going through screens. And millions of teachers rose to the occasion. We know it was chaotic, that it was not perfect, and that we fell short in giving our kids what they needed and deserved. But teachers, with their principals and district leaders and other school staff, went above and beyond, consistently doing their best to continue to reach every child. For this, we salute every teacher. Our nation owes them a debt of gratitude. And so this is why we begin this year's series of webinars with the top 2 teacher leaders in the country, Randi Weingarten and Becky Pringle, who we will hear from shortly as they reflect on the lessons learned from this pandemic, the lessons so far, and how we move forward. Later this afternoon in our 3 p.m. Eastern Time webinar, we will hear from a panel of teacher leaders from various teacher voice groups who will provide reflections and insights from the conversation that we will have now. Joining me and co-moderating this session are 2 colleagues, Peggy Brookins and Wes Moore, whose leadership during this time has provided valuable guidance and inspiration. They will kick us off with some opening remarks. They'll share the pre-recorded interviews they each did with our presenters. And then they'll follow up and engage in a conversation with Randi Weingarten, who we are thrilled was able to join us for this virtual discussion. So now let me just share a little bit about each of them and then we'll get started. Peggy Brookins is the president and CEO of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. President Barack Obama appointed Brookins to the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for African Americans. She came to the National Board from the Engineering and Manufacturing Institute of Technology at Forest High School in Ocala, Florida, which she co-founded and served as director and mathematics instructor. Wes Moore is the Chief Executive Officer of Robin Hood, one of the largest anti-poverty forces in the nation. Wes's first book, he is an author, The Other Wes Moore, captured the nation's attention on the fine line between success and failure in our communities and in ourselves. He is also the author of the recently released 5 Days. Wes, a Rhodes Scholar, graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Johns Hopkins University in 2001. He then served as a captain and paratrooper with the US Army's 82nd Airborne Division, including a combat deployment to Afghanistan. He later served as a White House fellow to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Our 2 presenters, Becky Pringle is president of the National Education Association, or the NEA, the nation's largest labor union. Becky is a middle school science teacher with 31 years of classroom experience and has distinguished herself as a fierce social justice warrior and defender of educator rights. And last but not least, our friend Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, or the AFT, a union of 1.7 million professionals representing teachers, paraprofessionals and school-related personnel, higher education faculty and staff, nurses and other healthcare professionals, local, state, and federal government employees, and my favorite field, early childhood professionals. She was elected in 2008, following 12 years as president of New York City's United Federation of Teachers and 6 years as a teacher at Clara Barton High School. So with that, let's bring on Peggy and Wes into starting off the conversation. And Peggy and Wes, welcome. Thank you for joining us on this first webinar of the year for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. You each had the privilege and opportunity to interview Randi and Becky. Wonder if, before we show the interviews, what that was like, maybe some insights on what you learned from that conversation, and thoughts about really engaging with the top nation's leaders for teachers, what that was like. So I'll turn it over to you, Becky. Peggy, maybe you want to start first, and then we'll turn it over to Wes.
Thank you, Yoli. It was just an honor and a pleasure to interview friend and colleague Becky Pringle. We've known each other for a long time and both have the same passions around the work, around education, around social justice, around teacher voice, and around the respect for the profession and those who do this work on a daily basis. So during the interview, getting to ask Becky those essential questions, particularly in the current climate, about what she thinks is necessary to move, education forward, but also to move this country forward when it comes to how we view teachers, what is needed, and what supports should be in place in order to make that happen. You'll hear her passion as she speaks. And one of the things that came over to me very clear was the fact that she realized none of us can do this work alone, and that we need partnerships. We need to be able to listen. We need to be able to help those who are closest to the work and doing that work on a daily basis, particularly now, and to focus in on those areas of greatest need. We know COVID, unveiled some ugly truths that we all knew were already there. Now we can't avoid them. So I think in the interview, you'll hear her passion for pushing that work forward from now and forever.
Thank you, Peggy. Wes, come on in and let's begin the conversation. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for the amazing interview that you did with Randi. So what was that like for you in having the opportunity to speak to one of our nation's top education leaders? What did you learn? And then once you give us your reflections, we'll show the videos.
Yeah, so it was, so first, hello everybody. And it is an honor to be with all of you today and to really be amongst people who I admire and deeply respect the work that you are doing. So thank you. Thank you for having me. And it was a true joy having a chance to talk with Randi and just to, hear perspectives on both where we are, but also where we are going. I think one thing that we see and our conversation really delved into was going on the fact that how unbelievably unfair it's been for our nation's children this year. How unbelievably unfair it's been for their caregivers, how unbelievably unfair it's been for the teachers, for the counselors, for the principals, for everyone on board. Because I think we have seen this year the resilience of our students, and that's been put on full display. It's just unfortunate that we've had to ask them to be so resilient. It's unfortunate that we've had to ask them to make this measure of resiliency such a prerequisite to be able to make it through. And I think when I think about some of the dynamics of the conversations that we did have, and some of the takeaways was, and you'll hear it in the interview, when we talk about what exactly that means. It's understanding the holistic nature of the importance of our institutions of education. It's understanding the fact that when we're talking about our schools, we are not just talking about places where our students are educated and they get degrees or credentials. We're also talking about the largest food providers in our country for our students. We're talking about the largest mental health providers for our students. We're talking about the largest childcare provider for our families. And so the holistic nature and the holistic need for the support of our schools, you see how the implications of it are showing themselves in not just things like grades and standardized testing, but they're showing themselves in just the way our students exist and live and survive. I think another big thing that was able to show was a lot of the basics that we should have anticipated were not put in place. When we knew that we were going to have to go to a fully virtual environment, and again, the truth is, we knew that as early as the spring, that's what the fall was probably going to have to look like for at least a good portion, whether, if not all, of our students going in, because of we were still being ravaged by this virus that, especially come the spring, we still did not know enough about. And the fact that if you look at the state of Maryland as just one example, where nearly 40% of students do not have consistent Wi-Fi, consistent tablets, where we were asking questions early days, questions such as, do you have a tablet or a device in your household? Until it took months for us to realize that was actually an irrelevant question if you have 4 children. So things like this that just took us a lot longer to be able to catch up to where we needed to get to, that it wasn't even just about, do we have the right answers? It was, are we even asking the right questions? That we're now seeing the larger implications for. So I really enjoyed the opportunity to speak with Randi, just getting her thoughts and her ideas and truthfully her counsel, because you'll see in the interview that she goes into detail about what advice would she give, or is she giving, to the new Secretary of Education as they're coming in at a time that truthfully, this is the most complicated entry for a Secretary of Education that the Secretary of Education role has ever seen. And so what advice are we giving as we're thinking about this new seat and this new leader who's taking on this role?
Thank you, Wes. And thank you, Peggy. Great way to introduce the conversations that we are about to experience ourselves, the interviews with Becky Pringle from the NEA and Randi Weingarten from the AFT that both of you did. So Sierra, let's show the videos.
So as we look ahead, it's important to reflect and look back, as all MBCTs do, and we want to take stock and learn from the hard lessons that we've learned the last 10 months. So from your perspective, when it comes to education, what are the major lessons so far? And what are the near-term implications of those lessons for the remainder of this school year, this summer, and the beginning of next year?
Wow. One of the things I have said throughout the many, many interviews I've done and panels and conversations, that one of the things that we have to remember is that we are in the throes of a pandemic. And who has lived through that? There are a few people alive now who lived through the one in 1919 and 20, but this is not something any of us have experienced before. And so as we think about the lessons that we've learned and what we need to carry forward, as we continue to try to do our best as educators to do the jobs we love and to play such an integral role in the fabric of the society, it is important as educators to reflect on those learnings. And it also is important for us to find our voices and talk about what we need to do in our society to make things better for our students. So when I think about one of the first lessons that many have learned, and Peggy, you and I have talked a lot about this, we talk a lot about this spotlight that's now shining on the inequities in our systems. Well, you and I both know those inequities existed forever, right?
Correct.
It wasn't about that all of a sudden it came into being. No, you and I fought alongside each other to fight for equity and access and opportunity for those students who have been forever marginalized, particularly based on race. Our Black and Brown Indigenous students, our API students, our students with disabilities, our students who live in those isolated communities, our students who have been living in generations of poverty. We know that they have been disparately impacted by this pandemic, as they are with every kind of calamity that hits our earth and our society. And so COVID-19 was no different. So our students and their families were more impacted by the pandemic itself, and then the crises that were spawned by this pandemic. So crises in healthcare, and crises in housing, and crises in their economic security, all of those things, all of those compounding systems that just exacerbated those inequities that already existed. And then, of course, through these last 9 months, they just have been exacerbated, right? As those systems compounded on each other. And so as we think about how that impacted our education system, our students' ability to learn and access to opportunity, the pandemic hit. And then in an instant, our students and our educators were thrown into virtual learning. And we knew right away, not just our students, and Peggy, you know this, not just our students, but our educators didn't have the tools they needed.
That is
Whether,
correct.
right? Whether it was
We had
literally
to pivot ourselves.
right, whether it was the digital tools themselves or the ability to teach in a virtual environment. I'm a science teacher. I taught science I'm a teacher of students, of course, but I taught my students science. And in 8th grade, you know, the wonder years, those babies with attitude. And so it's really important for me to connect to them through experiential learning. And I was thinking about that, and I thought, and I know you too in math, you know, wow, how would I do that? How would I transform that learning overnight without access to tools, without access to time? And Peggy, as a national board certified teacher, you know this. You know, you're not only steeped in that reflection part of your practice, but you also are steeped in an understanding it is that collaborative practice, right? That ability to work together and to solve tough and wicked problems together. When we were thrown into this virtual environment, that at least at the outset got in the way of that. And when our educators were in systems where administrators and others who were dictating what should happen in teaching and learning didn't understand that and didn't value us as the professionals we are and allow us the time to learn and to plan and to think and to reflect and to assess and all of those things we know we need to do as educators, then we saw and what we learned throughout this time was that when we didn't have that opportunity, then the learning and lives of our students suffered. I asked Peggy, I asked our staff and our leaders to do something for me about in May, because I had a theory. I had a theory that for those districts, those administrators and parents and educators and schools that had already embraced the concept of community schools, that they were faring better in this moment. And they did that research for me, and my theory on the case was proven true. You know, I'm a scientist, so it's all about theories and proving with evidence those theories. And what we saw was in those schools where they'd already built those partnerships with their boys and girls clubs, so they could provide that additional assistance for students whose parents were essential workers and had to go back to work and couldn't sit with them at the computer to help them learn. Those students who needed that access to healthcare and families that needed access to testing and all of that. That they had that partnership with the hospital, that they had a partnership with the food banks, with those families, parents who had been laid off and they were struggling to feed their families. They already had those processes, systems, and structures in place to support their students and their families in this holistic way. And you and I have talked a lot about, you know, that whole student kind of teaching and learning, that they were faring better, and they were, Peggy. They were faring better. So what we've learned is that we've got to think about education. First of all, we have to reclaim public education as a common good for this country, as the foundation of our democracy. So that's first of all. But we've got to understand, Peggy, that it's a shared responsibility. As educators, we are stepping up to do our part. But we cannot do that alone. There are all of these systems impacting our students' ability to learn. If they are hungry, they can't learn. If they don't have glasses, they can't learn. If they are so afraid that their parents are going to or have already lost their jobs, they can't learn. If they are mourning the loss of their grandparents and friends at a disparate rate because of this pandemic, they can't learn. And so it's going to take that shared responsibility to ensure that every student has what they need when they need it to live into their brilliance. That's what we've learned.
Oh, and that's a lot. And there's still so much to do. And you have hit on a point that I think that a lot of us are realizing we cannot do this work alone. We've worked for years since the existence of National Board very closely with the NEA. And just thinking about the campaign for grade level reading and how long it's prioritized the importance of family engagement, the nurturing and productive partnerships between teachers and parents, and what you just talked about, what the pandemic exposed, and the potential for these partnerships to now think about how you can invest in communities, because as you said, that light is shining on something that you and I know was already there. So what could we do next? We know that President-elect Biden has committed to building back better. What could building back better mean for the public school system?
President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris talk a lot about, their first order of business, and that is to get control of the pandemic. And we all know that that's what needs to happen. They value us as educators, Peggy, and the role that we can and must play in public education, and in the decisions that are made right now, and in making sure that those decisions are steeped in our desire to really transform our public education system. Because Peggy, you and I both know that public education was not designed to be what we need it to be.
No.
And what we need it to be is a racially and socially just and equitable system that's actually designed to prepare every student, everyone, to succeed in a diverse and interdependent world. It wasn't designed for that. So we have to actually transform that. And so what we see, the hope that we see in the Biden-Harris administration, is their understanding that as professionals, we are the ones who should be making those teaching and learning decisions. I don't know about you, Peggy, but I am so excited that in the White House, we will have an educator in Dr. Jill Biden, and a fellow NEA member, by the way, who actually understands it. I don't know how she's going to do this, but she has vowed to continue to teach. And how exciting would that be? That she is continuing her learned experience as an educator, continuing to talk to us as educators about what's happening, so that we can partner with the administration, with the White House, with the Department of Education in ways that we never have before. To transform this system. And so one of the things that we are looking to do with them is to really take on an antiquated funding system that, again, was not designed to be equitable. It's not. And we've got to take that on.
Absolutely.
Right? Is systems, all the federal system as well as the state systems all over this country that have disinvested in public education. So we've got to take that on, and the Biden-Harris administration understands that. But it's got to be about more than that. You and I have talked a lot about building really transforming even the accountability system that we have in education in a way that it not only talks about the academic learning of students, but it talks about the social and emotional learning of students. We're struggling with how we measure that, but we've got to figure that out, because that's so essential. It's about us as educators and how we teach in a new and different way. And so those are the kinds of things, and that's why the concept around approaching education from that larger place, so that we are focused on making sure that we are talking about our students as whole students, and approaching it from a holistic place, so that they are prepared to be those leaders today. By the way, they are leaders right now. I'm a big proponent of that, student agency. Those leaders of today, and those productive citizens of tomorrow who will be prepared to lead the just society that we all so desire.
So Becky, I want you to expand on something, and here's the opportunity right now to just look right in the camera. I know you're going to have a chance to talk to President-elect Biden's nominee for Secretary of Education. He was announced a few weeks ago. So what clear priorities, opportunities, and approaches would you have him focus on, primarily for what we know that we are interested in? And knowing that we have a teacher in the White House now, and someone who understands that we can walk in the room and don't have to explain, our 7-hour day is actually a 14-hour day and our weekends are not free. So what would you say to him even before, this meeting I know the two of you are going to have, and I wish I was a fly on the wall?
Yes, we have had conversations already. I've had conversations already with, and I'm not sure the right way to phrase, Secretary of Education-Designee, I think that's right, Cardona, and I've had an opportunity to talk several times, and I'm most encouraged by the fact that as a teacher and then and later as an administrator, and he characterized himself as an administrator, as a teacher's administrator. And what he meant by that was that he never forgot what it meant to be a teacher, and that he honored and respected teachers, and that it to collaborate with teachers uh, expanded his power and his reach and his opportunities to do what he needed to do for his students and for public education. And so he was taking that, he plans to take that mindset into his position as Secretary of Education. So we talked a lot about what that looked like. And we've been working, Peggy, with other education stakeholders at the national level. We had a call to action last year for national stakeholders, the chief state school officers and the PTA, with parents and with school boards, with administrators, to talk about how we could create what we're calling a labor management collaboration, where we actually develop the systems, processes, and structures to collaborate and to sustain that collaboration, so that we actually institutionalize that shared responsibility that I talked about before in a real and meaningful way. So we talked about that. We talked about a lot, Peggy, we talked a lot about racial justice. He is committed to, as you are, and I am, diversifying the teaching profession. We talked about the fact that, what was it, 3 years or so ago, that the students in our public schools were predominantly students of color. That happened about 4 years ago. And the fact that we needed to pay attention to not only recruiting teachers of color, but retaining teachers of color, because not only did we have a disparate amount of teachers of color in the teaching profession, but they were leaving at a disparate rate. And so he actually has done that work in Connecticut. And then the other thing he talked about, as it relates to racial justice, Peggy, is he did work in Connecticut around ethnic studies, because he understands that it is so important to value the different cultures that our students bring with them into our classrooms. And you know that as an accomplished teacher, that our students can't learn from us if they don't know and believe that we respect and honor and value their cultures and their history and the role they play in the history of this country, that for too often has either been ignored, distorted, or all outright lies that have been told about the history of this country. And he understands that, how important that is, not to just Black and Brown and Indigenous students, but to our white students as well. So they have a more complete understanding of history of this country, and they embrace that, the richness of the diversity of this country. And so in terms of his priorities in his role as Secretary of Education, he does understand that we have to reinvest in public education. And he does see it as the foundation of this democracy. And he understands that he must partner with and value. He talked a lot about revaluing and respecting the role of educators. He talked about paying them in a way that is commensurate with the important work they do, so they don't have to have 3 and 4 and 5 jobs, so they actually can focus on their profession and improving their professional practice. We talked about the need to reinvest in educators in a way that they are prepared before they are teachers of record to understand the importance of restorative practice and how to teach in that way, and their role in leading in their profession and in public education. And so he understands that we must reground teachers in that professional practice and professional excellence, and provide us with that authority that we as professionals must have in making teaching and learning decisions for our students and for our schools.
Becky, this next question is about slowing and stopping learning loss and accelerating learning loss recovery. We know those are major priorities for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading and for many others across the country as well. So toward that end, CGLR has focused on a three-pronged strategy to mobilize local communities, especially local funders as well.
So Peggy, I really applaud the Campaign for Grade Level Reading's approach to and really deep thinking about this. There's no question that we know that we have students who since April haven't had access to online learning, and for those who continued in virtual learning environments, we know that they did not necessarily have access to classroom studies that their teachers and other educators were providing throughout this pandemic. And so we have work that we must do, and I really appreciate that that CGLR is thinking deeply about how we can provide those tutorial services and focusing on assisting parents in that, because our parents have been really working side by side with us, parents and families working side by side with us throughout the pandemic to try to assist with our students learning. So I applaud them for doing that. I also want to particularly call out the approach that they're thinking about in terms of that cross-sector planning. Absolutely essential. If we are going to address the needs that our students have right now and into the future, that has to happen. It's got to be, and I talked earlier about that, right? That has to be all of us thinking about what our role and responsibility is in that, and not only the planning, honestly, but Peggy, also in the implementation. Third, a focus that they have laid out is really important, really important, that learning happens everywhere. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because we've all been talking about and using the phrase learning loss. But, you know, my grandson moved in with me and his family moved in with me in March, Peggy. So I've actually been living virtual learning for a third grader. We welcomed him with a sign, "Welcome to third grade, Carter." So he's in the basement right now, and he is learning in a virtual environment. And so I've gotten an opportunity to see his progress throughout the year. And one of the things that I've seen myself, but as I talk to educators and parents and students throughout the country, because NEA did a survey of our students too, because I wanted to hear from them. They're not viewing this period of time as a learning loss, because they are learning. They are learning. They're learning all. My grandson had the American Ballet Theater members of their company come in and teach them just a little piece of the Nutcracker, and they performed it. They're learning in this moment. What we have to think about is what we know. We've talked about, you know, educators, we know what that third grade curriculum, we know what's important for them to learn in that third grade curriculum that prepares them to take that next step and prepares them for fourth grade, right? And so we need to know what that is that they yet need to learn, and how best to fill in those gaps with them. And that absolutely is going to take a lot of creativity. It's going to take partnership. It's going to take thinking about where that learning can happen and when it can happen, and who needs to help us to close those gaps so our students are ready for that next step in their learning journey.
Thanks, Sierra. We're going to move right into the next video.
From your perspective, when it comes to education,
what have been some of the major lessons that we have learned so far? And what are some of those the near-term implications from that we should be learning as we think about the remainder of the school year this summer, and then also potentially going into next school year?
I would say that that there's been different lessons as this pandemic has continued, and we could spend many hours on it. There's been the issue of not acting as a country together in an emergency like this in a way that every public health expert would tell you to do, which is being honest, being transparent, and creating trust. And in the absence of that, you have three real problems. You have the problem of the exacerbation of inequity, both or education inequity, health inequity, economic inequity, which has disproportionately affected people who are most at risk to begin with. Before the pandemic, 40% of Americans could not put $400 together in an emergency. Before the pandemic, 16 million kids did not have access to any kind of real speed, I wouldn't even say high speed internet. Before the pandemic, 30 million kids were getting fed every single day at school. So the pandemic upends so much of the safety net, as tattered as it was, that we have. And so that one of the lessons is, how do you build that back better? How do you actually not just restore what we had, but how do you actually take this and reimagine a different future because of all those inequities? The second lesson is to actually think about the resilience of Americans, and particularly American children. And that, and so I often resist the term, what are we going to do about learning loss? And try to frame it as, what are we going to do to deal with the effects of COVID on kids and on their futures? The instructional effects, the academic effects, the emotional effects, the social effects, knowing full well that so many kids have more resiliency than any of their adult counterparts could have imagined, given everything that has happened here, particularly the corrosive effect of all this isolation. So separate and apart from the illness and the death and being scared about, whether mom has a job or what's going to happen in terms of will we get evicted or not. But it's the basic lack of, we're social creatures, and that isolation. And how do we then, because of the amazing resilience of children, regardless of who they are or where they come from, how do we patch into that and actually create a joy and a confidence instead of continuation of a message that says, okay, see how much you've lost? Now we're going to put you into remediation. Let's reframe that in terms of what we need to do about joy and honoring that resilience. And like we've in some ways done when veterans came home from a war, and honor that and honor what we've then be able to do. And the third lesson for me is the absolute heroic, Herculean effort of people who have changed virtually everything they've done. I have the honor of representing over 200,000 healthcare personnel, where our union is now the second largest nurse union in the United States, and we're the second largest teachers union. And so we have seen people whose lives are completely upended themselves turn on a dime in a period of time where the pandemic response has been based on incompetence and lies. try to figure out how to engage kids, how to feed kids, how to protect people, often without the necessary protections themselves. And as much as they know that this is unsustainable, and as much as they know that they want to be back in school working with kids, because in school learning, in relationship, in community is absolutely essential, they have done everything in their power to help calm a nation, protect a nation, feed a nation, engage a nation, particularly its kids. And that heroism on a day-to-day basis is so amazing to me. And all of the kind of attempts of those who try to pit nurses against doctors, teachers against parents, my anger is that how dare you pit people against each other in a pandemic, which we're still only learning the true nature of it. So the lessons I've learned is about the character of America in the midst of such great tragedy and such great inequity, how you see huge resilience and huge compassion about who the people are who have been the essential workers and the helpers, as Mr. Rogers would say, and who our children are.
This is about a community infrastructure that serves the whole need for the children. So I guess my next question then is, as President-elect Biden, he's prioritized this idea of a safe reopening of schools by the end of the first 100 days. When you think about that in context of all of that, what would be required from not just an administration, but from all of us in order to make something like that happen? And is that achievable?
We need to have those safeguards, those mitigation efforts, and they need to be clear and transparent. That includes things like masks and social distancing and, cleaning and ventilation. But if we're going to have the kind of not knowing what's going on with these new strains and things like that, we need to layer one more mitigation strategy, which is the early warning system of testing. 40% of COVID travels asymptomatically. And even though we know, because of the testing that has happened, that the rate of transmission, the mitigation strategies have helped very effectively in elementary schools reduce transmission. We don't really know what's going to happen with this new strain. We don't really know what's going to happen in terms of this surge. So making sure we can have this early warning system and clear measures for what trigger opening and closing of schools, like frankly the private schools are doing right now, that's going to be something important as well. So I would call that mitigation and early warning. Three more things we need to do. We need to make sure that we are using that there's two fights we have here: the fear of disinformation and the science. And so to deal with the fear, whether it's a fear of a vaccine or whether it's a fear because somebody is at risk, we need to be really good about reasonably accommodating those who are at risk, them or their families. We do that with kids and parents all the time by saying, do you want in-school instruction? Do you want remote? We need to do that for teachers as well and for other school employees as well. Fourth, we need to prioritize that if we are prioritizing schools, in-school learning for kids, then we need to prioritize vaccinations for educators after healthcare workers and those in nursing homes. And unfortunately, with the piecework, patchwork process that we've had since COVID has started, it's going to become as catch can. The Biden administration needs to help make that a priority for educators and align it with the schools that we're opening. And the last thing is this: any superintendent or any of us who've been around education for a long time will tell you, these are a lot of moving pieces. You're dealing with an invisible virus that has significant, that you can mitigate, but has significant effects if it's not mitigated. So the places, and the the education secretary designee is really good at this. The places that have worked together, that have what you call a situation room or a labor management context or whatever, those things would be really good. That collaboration would be really good. So that's kind of the basics. But frankly, if we don't also then use this opportunity to wrap services around schools, to really think about how to plan a second semester, to actually really make sure that we're meeting the needs of kids, to have the guidance counselors, to have the nurses, then we're going to lose a real opportunity for kids to thrive. But really, truly, also making sure we are wrapping services around and we are really meeting the needs of parents, of kids, and of educators. That's what creates the trust that will make this enduring, given that we really have no idea what's around the corner until a vaccine fully protects America.
That's right. And you think about, because what in essence you're talking about is how do we have a holistic buildup?
Exactly right.
How do we make sure this buildup, because the breakdown on so many fronts, we have seen that in so many cases by the decisions that were made and by, frankly, just an extraordinarily lackluster federal response, that our children and the families were not a priority in
Right.
terms of how this was going to take place. And so as we're talking about the holistic buildup, when you're thinking about the new Secretary of Education-elect, so much of this is about how are we rethinking systems, teams, structures to make sure that things that were not very high on the priority list are now getting moved up on a priority list. What advice would you give, specifically with the idea that this is not just simply about one element of what we want to address, but how do we think holistically about making sure that this is not a lane, but actually a lens in the way that we're putting together our approaches?
So, look, I've known Dr. Cardona since he worked as a principal in Meriden. We represented the educators in Meriden, and we started an innovation fund, I don't know, about a decade or so ago. And Meriden was the first, we required grants to go to locals that were working in collaboration with their management. And Meriden was the first place we worked. And so we've known Dr. Cardona for a long, long time. He understands that it takes a village and that you have to solve problems. And that, and if you know him at all, his life story is the American dream.
Yes.
And so he sees opportunity where others may see challenge. And he sees, he sees, yes, we can, where others wonder whether they can, deal with the obstacles. Mm-hmm. And so, but he does it in a way that's very pragmatic and that is very much done through a lens of equity. So I think what he'll do operationally is really work with people and bring people together. And I've had conversations with some of the superintendents I know well about how we need to help him. And I know that NEA feels the same way, and NEA and AFT have been working working well together. And during this whole process, Becky and I talk to each other frequently. We don't even bother saying hello anymore when we, we just want to run right into a conversation about whatever we're talking about. But that's, I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but that's a sign of
that's right.
Us really working together. And so, but we'll have to find ways of pulling all of us together and of making sure that people don't feel like this year has created huge loss academically for them. What I worry about is that there will be a failure to remember that we've just gone through what will be a year of dislocation, and that in a few months from now, people will forget that that has happened, and will want kids to be in exactly the place they should have been in if it had not happened, because that's going to put huge pressure on the people who are closest to kids as well as the kids themselves.
Mm.
So I think we have to, that's why I keep talking about how do we create a goal of how do we deal with the academic, the social, the emotional needs, and think about this summer to next year as a year of not just healing, but a year of learning, a year of engagement, and a year of really pulling ourselves together again, because we've just been through a war. And I think that's going to be Dr. Cardona's challenge, and that's going to be Joe Biden's challenge. And I think what we'll see is, as if we can actually create the trust and agency to do that, so that people can see we are really working to make sure we're making kids a priority. We are, also dealing with the stress and strain that teachers and communities have faced during this period of time, and that people are actually operating together. I think that's going to be very helpful. Obviously, it's going to take systems work. It's going to take resources, but it's also going to take best practices. And the Department of Education can be a clearinghouse for those best practices, both on a systems level as well as on an innovation level.
And you're right, where we can't look at it almost in this sense of reflection or in retrospect, because we're still in it.
Yeah.
We're still in the middle of everything we're talking about right now. I mean, I think about, in this moment that we're talking now, or just earlier today, Dr. Fauci says, he predicts, we could be looking at an October, November sense to a return to normalcy, which if that is correct, it means we're almost halfway done.
Right. And that's why, and that's why, I don't mean to interrupt you. That's why, if you think about where we were last September and October, we were in a better situation than we are in some ways right now. No one really knows on this side of the pond what the transmissibility or the virulence is of this new strain.
Right.
And whether or not the vaccine will work on it. But my point in saying all this is that if we're honest with each other and create trust and agency, that we're all in it together, and don't go from denials to magical thinking,
right,
but go from the denials to we're all in it together, and what do we need to do to protect people's lives, but also make sure that the effects of COVID don't continue to to terribly hurt children.
yes.
How do we work together to find these ways of operating? That's something that that I think Dr. Cardona has the muscle for. I think that Dr. Biden wants to do, that the vice president-elect wants to do, the president-elect wants to do, but it's going to require us creating that infrastructure to do that. So things like community schools,
Yes.
help create that infrastructure. Things like, what are we going to do for vaccine distribution? What are we going to do over the summer? How do we share good strategies? So I'm excited about planning in a time that's like no other. And we're going to have to work together and come up with solutions that then people buy into and people feel are doable. So it may look different, Wes, than either you or I are thinking about right now. It may be that kind of working together will come up with something that none of us have thought about yet.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the work of working together, knowing full well, I'll go back to the lessons from the beginning, the resilience and the fortitude of children and the need of all of us to help protect their and make sacrosanct their future, but also the amazing goodwill and Herculean efforts and dedication and compassion of the educators and the other frontline essential workers.
Amen.
That's an alchemy that if we have the resources and we figure out the strategies, that's going to be amazing.
You actually touched on something that I actually wanted to lean in on, because I think it's an important point, because whether we're talking about Dr. Cardona, whether we're talking about Dr. Biden, whether we're talking about the president-elect or the vice president-elect, so much of how we're thinking about education also, it's a federalist conversation, right? It's governors, it's state legislators, it's people on a very local level who will receive support and guidance from Washington. But what happens in Mississippi or Washington State or New York State or Maryland is very much going to be led by who is sitting in state houses and the legislators and how they want to put their process as to how they're thinking about this reinvention and protecting our children and our families in ways that they are not being protected right now.
Exactly.
So what counsel and advice would you give to advocates, supporters, families who are saying, what conversation should I have with my governor or my state legislator? Because in many ways, how they're talking about it and how they're thinking about it is going to have as much influence on what happens in my classroom or in my school or in my district as the conversations that are taking place in Washington, D.C.
So look, the Department of Education is not the school board for 16,000 districts.
Exactly.
The school board for 16,000 districts are the school boards for those 16,000 districts.
Right.
And unfortunately, what the federal government should be doing is creating guardrails and guidance and resources. And then when we have best practices around the country and strategies that seem to work, to be able to disseminate those things. That's what it should be doing. And of course, because the education department is a civil rights organization as well, we have to make sure that those who have the least get the most, and that we're not leaving people behind, particularly kids at risk, kids who are vulnerable.
Wow, that was a very, very rich conversation. Thank you, Peggy and Wes. You both have been hanging out with Oprah. You had such an engaging conversation with both Becky and Randi, and a lot to digest. There's a lot of questions that we're going to try to get to in about 5 minutes or so. Before we do that, I wanted to, Randi, say thank you once again for not only doing the interview, but on behalf of the campaign for making time to come back and join us for a little bit of a follow-up to the conversation. And before Peggy and Wes engage you, just for a few more minutes, and as a point of personal privilege, I'd like to briefly acknowledge the Campaign for Grade Level Reading's focus on, and my job, on elevating parents as that important special sauce. We call it the secret sauce for student success. We know that they are the co-producers of good outcomes for their children, and we see them as essential partners in that productive parent-teacher partnership. So given that, I'd love your thoughts on what we must do going forward to build on that amazing relationship between parents and teachers that we have seen over the past 10 months. How do we hold on to that, deepen that, strengthen that, and keep our eye on that? And Randi, unmute yourself.
And I am muted. That is, please unmute yourself is probably going to be in Webster's as the most common phrase from this pandemic.
Yep.
So I'm a big believer in trust. And I think that we're going to have to work very hard to stop people who don't want to fund schools, who don't want to fund tutoring, who don't want to fund community schools, who don't want to do all the stuff that we just talked about, who will then instead engage in destabilization and divide and conquer and have us fighting over what the terrible effects of COVID as opposed to working together. So the trust and collaboration become really important. That starts with honesty, it starts with transparency, it starts with understanding that we've just been through a huge pandemic and there's a lot of loss as part of that. I know I focus on the positive instead of negative because there's not a child in the world that caused COVID. They should not have had to deal with the effects of all of this. And so, we need to lift them up. We need to understand what our responsibilities are to help them have and seize their future. But I think that at least personally, my view is, clearly there's lots of loss, but how do we make sure they don't see themselves as losers? How do we make sure they see themselves as part and parcel of what we need to do to reclaim their future? So parents and educators are key. All of the philanthropy is very important. What Robin Hood did, for example, in New York and initially about the funding of food banks and all these other things are absolutely essential. But parents and families and educators are going to be the key people on the ground that help our kids feel safe and feel like the future is ahead of them, not behind them. And so that's why trust and transparency become really important, working together, fighting for the strategies that are going to work to deal with the effects of COVID, including academic, social, emotional recovery, but also really focusing, at least for me, on reclaiming their future and working together to do that.
Great, thank you for that reflection. Peggy, Wes, I'm gonna bring you both back in, get yourself off of mute. And I just invite you, if you have any additional conversation, question that you wanted to have with Randi before we get to Q&A in about 5 or 6 minutes, I wanted to give you the floor.
Absolutely. Wes brought up something that is so important, and it's around states and what states have to do. And then I know there are a couple of questions that are part of the Q&A, Randi, but they focus on systems. And when we think about systems, a lot of people have this myopic view of their own piece of that system. And I used to tell my engineering students, your body is a system. Do you want your heart to beat or your lungs to breathe? You need all of that. You need both of those. And you cannot give more to one than you give to the other to make a system work. So for me, and what you're talking about is that this overhaul of this entire system of how we view education, how we view, equity of economic disparities that have been going on forever. I think, we need to come together, pulling everybody in who's a part of this, and think about how do we fix this system that is out of whack.
So I find, Peggy, that and it's an honor to be with the two of you, and I do think, Wes, we should actually acknowledge that the moment about half an hour after we finished that interview, and I was in my office, which is literally 5 blocks from the Capitol, to witness what was going on, and you heard the sirens and it's just, I want to just acknowledge for a second that we're living in such uncertain times, and that part of what compels us to be together is that if we actually believe that our system of governments, of a democracy, is important to keep, and I do, that we have to work together. We don't have a choice. If we believe that we have an obligation to give to our children and grandchildren the kind of freedoms, as imperfect as they are, that we have inherited from our grandparents and from our parents. And so I think that's important just to acknowledge up front, given the moment that we're in. But to answer your question, Peggy, most people don't see systems because they've never actually worked in every aspect of it. People are their work lives are very fragmented. And so we have to actually tell the story about it and envision it and make sure that we can show why it's important to change these things. And that change can come from step by step, not just from putting the airplane together and saying, see, now it's together. And I think that part of this is a matter of how we communicate, how not only the urgency of change, but how different steps and strategies that people can take in. We meet people where they are on it. So people get the idea about resources. They see that when you meet individual children's needs, that makes a lot more sense than not. But then a system is required so we can do it for everyone. And I think we just have to figure out a way that we don't speak in pedagogical terms or in legalistic terms, and we actually meet people where they are and explain what we're trying to do and how.
Come
I'm
on
sorry.
in. I was gonna invite you, come on in.
No, I was just and first thank you for that, and also just thank you for for the questions, for the answers earlier. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we found ourselves, even when we have our initial conversation, where and that wasn't hyperbole, where we were literally hearing the sirens in the background about everything that was happening and the attack on the Capitol and the coup attempt. But it's also one of these things where I think for each and every one of us, we found ourselves wondering, what is it exactly that we can do in our own individual seats, in our own individual places, in our own individual spaces. And I know, this call also has a lot of people who are involved in the world of philanthropy or in the world of grant making, who say that, the work that happens on the grant making side is incredibly important, but it's also about how that can be used to leverage the other dollars, leverage government dollars. I think about in the work of Robin Hood, as you mentioned, just in these past months, throughout the Relief Committee, we've granted about $35 million on school-aged children and education, and how that works, including about a little over 8 million that came from the Relief Fund. But how do you see the role of philanthropy and grant makers in this larger conversation? Because so much of this is about systems and structures. What do you see as the role of some of these independent players in helping to help shape the dynamic and shape the conversation as well?
So I would add one more word to systems and structures, and that's strategies. What we used to think about is that you could replicate, like you cannot replicate Peggy Brookins. I'm sorry, you just can't replicate her. But what are the strategies that Peggy used when she taught her kids how to make drones? What are the strategies? What are the component parts? What can we develop muscle to do so that those leverageable strategies then can be used in places across the country? That helps create, create the systems and the structures. And so I think that one of the things, for example, when Betsy DeVos became education secretary, I said that I thought there were 4 strategies we really needed to focus on in order to help every single school be a place where parents wanted to send their kids, educators wanted to work, and kids were engaged. Obviously, they all took resources and they all took good management, but it was a focus on well-being, a focus on powerful instruction, a focus on actually training teachers and having teachers actually know how to do these kinds of things, and a focus on collaboration and collective responsibility. And that I saw those as strategies that would look different in different places. And so what I think philanthropy can do, there's so many needs. There's lots of relief needs, including how do we still get computers and internet to kids? There's relief needs in terms of issues around food insecurity. But there's also other needs going forward in terms of how we seed some work, some grants to have these strategies about how we do academic, emotional, and social recovery in a way that others can replicate. And in a way that gives educators some latitude instead of what I fear, which is we're going to have a whole bunch of tutoring and a whole bunch of what we did when we first started with standards, which was double and triple and quadruple periods of math and English. That's not going to be helpful to kids who feel like they've had so much loss already. How do we actually have a second semester this summer where we are investing in camps so that kids can go to summer camp that has a wide array of academic, social, emotional, physical kind of things so that they have that opportunity that rich kids have and that rich kids will be able to do this summer. So there may be things that philanthropy traditionally likes to invest in strategies, but there's also recovery and there's also the summer. And there's also, obviously long-term, all the things that Becky and I and the campaign for grade level reading, and both of you have talked about over and over again in terms of what do we do in terms of community schools? How do we create that infrastructure? High level instructional practices. How do we have strategies for collaboration? What does those summer schools, as I talked about, summer programming look like? What about diagnostic and formative assessments to inform teaching and learning? And all of those things, including educator latitude, we're going to need to show these are the things that work and communicate that and teach people how to do that.
Randi, Peggy, and Wes, I love this conversation. I do want to get us into some of the Q&A. So let's move into that now. And I do want to share with our audience, and there's still over 200 people listening here, that I don't think I've ever seen this many questions pop up in the chat and the Q&A. And I wish we could get to all of them. We probably won't. But they're still important to the campaign because it tells us what your questions are, what you're thinking about, what you're struggling with. So it does help inform future conversations. And we have a follow-up at 3 Eastern time to this conversation. So hopefully we'll get to you one way or the other. We have a very important partner that is part of the campaign for grade level reading, who, as we were planning this session, we thought we would bring her in to ask her first question, and it's Hetty Chang from Attendance Works. She's been thinking a lot about chronic absenteeism, as many of you know, has taught all of us in this country a lot about what that means and how to pay attention to that. So Hetty, if we could get you off of mute, we're not going to bring you on camera, but if you could ask your question, that would be great. We'll start with you. And I think Sierra is probably working on getting you unmuted. Are you with us, Hetty?
I am now. Can you hear me?
Fantastic.
Oh, yay. Thank you. It was so helpful. First of all, thank you, Wes, Peggy, Randi. It is so helpful. We need times to step back and reflect on where we're going. I think that is what will help us think about how do we move forward in these very challenging and uncertain times. And I particularly appreciate the ability to build upon educators who are at that first line. My question is about one of the core elements of the campaign, which is chronic absence, which I see as remaining a critical early warning sign and a cause of educational inequity, even as we've moved into remote and blended learning, as well as it was always the case in person. It highlights actually that need for family engagement, community and health partnerships, which Becky had actually talked about as showing that they have, when you put that in place with schools, because it's often about barriers that are beyond just the control of educators to address, it allows you to change outcomes. And I am pleased to say that Commissioner Cardona understands this well. He really made monitoring and addressing chronic absence a priority. And even during the pandemic, he actually made the collection and publication of public data a priority. So it was happening in real time. So it became a diagnostic, not an autopsy. My question is, I guess I'm going to direct it to Randi and Wes. For Randi, what is the role of unions? And for Wes, what is the role of philanthropy in ensuring schools can continue to take attendance every day? By the way, that is not necessarily the norm in every place. Many places stopped taking attendance during the spring, and only a portion of the states have reinstated daily attendance. And then also sharing that data so that it can activate early intervention and prevention across all forms of instruction. And I think we'll need to do this even more starting now, but then into the beginning of the school year, because we need to know in a leading way, when are we missing kids so we can take action?
Rand, you want to go? You want to go first? And
Sure, I'll do this. Look, I mean, I'm not a big believer in remote education, as people know. I wasn't before the pandemic, and I think the pandemic has proven that it is not a very good substitute. I think that what's happened is that teachers have been trying. Most of the teachers I know are doing some kind of attendance work in their classrooms. Most of the states that I've been in contact with have tried to figure out how to do this. I think that it's with all the different ways in which things are learning is being done. It's probably hard to create one huge data system, but I think it's really important to do, and we have to figure out how to do it in a consistent way. And I look forward to Dr. Cardona being there as part of that kind of guidance. The second piece is, though, we also have to have a support system, including guidance counselors and others, because it's not simply a child not being there. What are we going to do about it?
Absolutely.
And that's and that is something that I hear educators talk about all the time. I'd actually add one more layer of complexity here, which is the turning on and off of the camera, and then not being able, and the mute, and then not being able to see or hear or engage, which I hear all the time is something that is really, and how one figures out how to engage with all kids and keep all kids safe and during this period of remote.
What I would add from the philanthropic side, and first, it's a great question, and I'm so glad you asked the question, because when you're looking at the different dynamics and the reason that we have these type of gaps, we cannot talk about that without also, without stating full-throatedly the importance of addressing chronic absence. It's, to your point, whether it is students who are entering school unprepared, whether it is the summer learning loss, whether it's chronic absence, all of these are stilts that these measures of inequality stand on. And I think as important for us to understand, that if a student is chronically absent, it's also important for us to understand why. This idea and this myth that it's because of apathy or it's because of some lack of accountability. The reality is that when we continue to disaggregate the data, as we continue to look deeper, we have to understand that the reasons for chronic absence all are measures and are indicators of things that frankly have nothing to do with what's happening within the classroom, nor a level of interest of the student. And so part of the thing I think we have to do in the world of philanthropy is to be able to not just understand the what, but also understand the why. What are the things and the reason that we have the levers and the measures of chronic absence that students are facing? whether it is a student is taking on responsibilities in the home that need to be taken on, or whether there are housing challenges. I think about, for example, some of the work that we have funded is something called funding, it's called Gateway Housing. And that is all about improving student attendance for shelter residents and to fund Wi-Fi installation at homeless shelters and public libraries, to actually increase internet access in low-income communities, understanding the fact that if you have a student, if we understand how many students don't have consistent Wi-Fi access, as Randi points out, when you have a student who's dealing exclusively with remote access, and they're staying at a shelter, which around 20 to 30,000 kids in New York City alone every night are staying in, 20 to 30,000 children. And so if you do not have Wi-Fi access that can support them, that chronic absence that you see from that child is not because of apathy. It's not because they don't care. It's because we didn't care enough. And so when we're thinking about the role that we can play, philanthropy, in helping to fill those gaps, it really is twofold. It's to be able to be the risk capital, it's to be able to provide that type of funding for organizations like the Gateway Housing and that type of thing. But it's also to be able to use that research, to use that data, to use that convening power to continue to ensure that students that are being forgotten and left behind are not forgotten and left behind. That when we're coming up with packages about what are we doing to support things like student attendance and chronic absence and address chronic absence, that we're not forgetting about the fact that how many students every single night are finding different places to lay their head down. That we are considering the fact that when schools are absent, when as Randi was mentioned earlier, that our schools are the largest childcare provider inside of our country. And when you have situations where we have people who are working, who are trying to get back to work, and school buildings that are not open, who then oftentimes are taking on the responsibility of childcare inside of families? Oftentimes it's the oldest sibling, which is going to make their attendance more problematic. So it's both using philanthropy to understand the what, right? Using philanthropy to understand the data, understand the numbers we're talking about, but it is also using philanthropy to underscore the why and making sure that the whys are being addressed. And so we're adding a proper narrative as to why we have these challenges that we continue to see, particularly in this moment of distance learning.
Thanks, Wes. I'm going to try to get to 2 questions in the next 4 minutes. And I think we're prepared to unmute Tequila Brownie from the New Teacher Project. And she had a question around parents.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Peggy, Wes, and Randi. Thank you, all 3 of you, for your leadership and for your work. My question is actually related to parent choice. So for myself, I'm the parent of a 5th grader who attends public school. And for many parents that I know who are becoming even more proactive over the course of this past year about their child's education, given just the experiences that we've had, many are actually seeking different options for their children's education. And so parent choice and this notion of parent empowerment they're more real than ever, I think. And so my question to you, I guess I'll aim it at Randi, are we prepared to support that in how we're envisioning building back better? Not so much to the sense of the previous administration, that's not where I'm going, but as we think about parent choice, parent empowerment, we'd love to hear how you're thinking about how we envision that in building back better.
So I'm going to give you an unsatisfactory answer. I have to focus on how we ensure that public schools are foundational to our community and our democracy, and to have as much choice within the public school systems as possible. I've always been a big believer in that. I've been, from when I was a school teacher at Clara Barton High School in Brooklyn, New York, which was actually a CTE, a career tech school, even though my kids actually went and debated in the We the People competitions and won them on a statewide basis. And I only taught Black and brown kids in Brooklyn, New York. So our focus has to be, as our union, on how we ensure that we have the best public schools and strengthen them available to all parents, and that becomes a viable choice for all parents. Other people are going to focus on other things, but that is my focus.
Thank you, Randi. And one more question. If we could tee up Ellen Galinsky. She's somebody we all know and love, and she asked an important question for the campaign, recognizing that most of the conversation mostly has been around K-12, and she has a question about the young kids. Sarah, could you unmute Ellen Galinsky? Sorry, I didn't give you a heads up on that one.
I'm unmuted. Thank you very much.
Hey, Ellen.
Thank you. I actually have 3 issues. One is, how do we frame learning away from loss and recovery, to Randi's point of resilience and honoring what children have brought so that people aren't blamed. And also the issue of how we work toward more community schools. But the specific question that I have is younger children. We focus more on elementary aged and older children here. What about our youngest children? What are the lessons from the pandemic for them, Randi?
That's Ellen, that's a really good one. So I think that there's so I can tell you anecdotally, and I can tell you from what I'm seeing in terms of beginning research. Anecdotally, the social isolation has been really terrible. And trying to, and you know, that and the inequities in terms of, remember all the work that we've seen in terms of reading and what that means when kids are read to, and all these kinds of things. So we don't have data in terms of academic issues now, but we do have anecdotal, and we will get data in terms of academic issues. But the feeling like the isolation, the fear, kids pick that up immediately, and finding ways to create nurturing, to help recreate nurturing, stabilizing community, because parents have been doing as much as parents can possibly do, is very, very, very important.
Thank you, Randi. And we are at the end of our time, unfortunately. There were more than 20 questions still left. So we'll probably try to summarize those, send them to you, but also use them for our own insight about what questions, concerns, and interests people have. So before I close and tell you about the 3 o'clock follow-up webinar, I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us. Becky is not with us, but certainly we thank her for her voice and her insights as she did the interview with Peggy. Randi, thank you again, and Wes, for your partnership with the campaign, for being part of this first webinar of the year. And we look forward to an ongoing partnership and working together, which is, I think, the theme of this conversation, is the importance of all of us really holding hands, working together on behalf of kids. So on behalf of the campaign, thank you so much. For those of you that are ready to learn a little bit more and even have deeper questions about the early learning question, the afternoon webinar in a few minutes will bring a number of teacher leaders into the conversation, responding to what they heard, but also offering their own insights around lessons learned, around how we move forward together. So that's at 3 o'clock Eastern. There was a link to register. If you didn't register for that, we welcome you and hope you will join us. And for the rest of you, have a safe and healthy rest of the day and the week. And we look forward to more ongoing learning conversations with all of you as we continue our GLR Learning Tuesday series. Thanks again.